At the end of the Second World War, there was a huge hunt on for those members of the concentration camp staff who had inflicted suffering, execution and torture onto thousands of people. Millions of people were slaughtered inside of the gas chambers, forced into these small rooms by members of the SS. Some of those who were searched for included the commandants of various camps, and one of the most wanted was the commandant of the deadliest concentration camp of them all, Auschwitz. Rudolf Höss was the man who built Auschwitz from the ground up, and he dreamed of creating the deadliest site of slaughter that he could, and he wanted his camp to efficiently mass murder thousands. In total, 1.1 million people at least were killed at Auschwitz, but Rudolf Höss was at the end of the war arrested, and he was then tried and subsequently executed inside of his former camp, and he was the last person to be executed inside of Auschwitz on a specially built gallows. But Höss had before complained about the treatment he suffered, and he may have also been nearly killed during his arrest at the hands of a number of British forces and guards who wanted revenge and vengeance for those victims of Auschwitz. Welcome to The Untold Past. Today we look at the brutal arrest of the Commandant of Auschwitz, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Rudolf Höss oversaw the huge expansion of Auschwitz, and he himself introduced gassings to the camp, and he even oversaw the trials of this extermination method inside of the basements of Block 11, the punishment and torture centre, in his camp. Following the war he was captured, and he during the Nuremberg trials was not brought as a defendant to answer charges, but instead as a defence witness for senior SS official Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Höss did not help things with his admissions, and he brazenly bragged about the destructive nature of his work. He claimed at the trial that I commanded Auschwitz until the 1st of December 1945 and estimate that at least 2.5 million victims were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning, and at least another 500,000 succumbed to starvation and disease, making a total of about 3 million dead. This figure represents about 70 to 80% of all persons sent to Auschwitz as prisoners, the remainder having been selected and used for slave labour in the concentration camp industries. Included amongst the executed and burned were approximately 20,000 Russian prisoners of war, who were delivered at Auschwitz in Wehrmacht transports, operated by regular Wehrmacht officers and men. The remainder of the total number of victims included around 100,000 German Jews, and greater numbers of citizens, mostly Jewish, from the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Greece, or other countries. We executed about 400,000 Hungarian Jews alone at Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. Höss later changed his death toll and revised it to around 1.1 million, and he claimed even Auschwitz had its destructive capabilities and limits. However, Höss did not serve as a commandant of the camp for the whole of the Second World War, and he was actually sacked from his position overseeing the site. This was because there had been an internal investigation in the SS regarding his conduct and the fact he had been accused of having an affair with a prisoner of the camp, who then got pregnant. Höss, it was claimed, brought the SS into shame and disrepute, and with this he was relieved of command. But because he was great friends with the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, he did not receive too much punishment for this. Some commandants who brought the SS into disrepute, such as Karl Otto Koch of Buchenwald, were actually executed, but Höss was told to step down, but he would then be brought back to Auschwitz in summer 1944 to oversee what was known as Operation Höss, a deadly killing objective that carried out his name. In May 1944, Operation Höss claimed the lives of 430,000 Hungarian Jews who had been deported to Auschwitz en masse, and they were all slaughtered in 56 bloody days. This almost brought the camp to a standstill, and Auschwitz could not deal with the sheer amount of people being killed, and many were shot in large pits to speed up the execution process, rather than using gassing, and the crematoria ovens could not keep up, and because of this thousands of people were being burned in the open in large fires. It was hell on earth, and Höss, after overseeing this, was then dispatched to the all-female concentration camp of Ravensbrück, where he was in charge of sending thousands of women to their deaths inside of the small gas chamber there. Höss was actually brought to Ravensbrück to oversee this gas chamber's creation, and he was obviously seen by Heinrich Himmler as an expert on this sort of killing method. At the end of the Second World War, he was advised by the head of the SS to obtain false papers and to try and live under a false identity. Himmler told many of his close allies to do this, and to conceal themselves in ordinary jobs to not arouse suspicion. Höss was someone who was being hunted for massively, and his identity was no secret at all, but for some time the Allies could not find him. He had not been imprisoned inside of the large prisoner of war camps, and there were specific task forces launched to try and seize the Commandant of Auschwitz. There was a fear that he had taken his own life, and that he would never be brought to trial, and Rudolf Höss had been given a cyanide capsule by Himmler in case he did fall into Allied captivity. Höss was living inside of Gottrüpel under the false name of Franz Lang, and he maintained that he was a former member of the Kriegsmarine, or the German Navy. But he posed as a gardener, and for around a year Höss avoided any form of capture, and he continued to work undetected. His wife Hedwig Höss had been arrested, and she was accused of being an accomplice to her husband's crimes, and interrogators tried to wear her down to admit where her husband was. Eventually Hedwig told the Allies about her husband's location, and there were hunts launched for him. It was in 1946, a year after the war had come to an end, that a German Jewish man named Hans Alexander led the search for Rudolf Höss. He was a Nazi hunter, and was part of the British Army's No. 1 War Crimes Investigations Team, and these were actively looking for Auschwitz's former commandant. Alexander himself was a captain inside the Royal Pioneer Corps, and he received information about Höss's location, and he gathered a small band of British soldiers to go and seize Höss, and to try and then bring him under arrest. Many of the soldiers in this group knew what sort of man he was, and they knew he was someone who was responsible for the slaughter of over 1 million people. They had the intention to cause Höss some damage, and there would have been a fear that he would not be brought to trial, and that Alexander's men may have killed him by their administration of rough justice, or that Höss, when seeing these men coming for him, would consume cyanide. This is exactly what happened, as when the gardener was approached by a group of British soldiers, as in Alexander's men inside of Gottrüpel, Höss allegedly pulled out a cyanide capsule, and he tried to bite down on this, but it did not work. Alexander knew who he was dealing with, and his men then seized the gardener, and they knew this was their man. Höss was ordered to take off his wedding ring, and Alexander then threatened to slice off his finger if he did not do this, but he knew that the wedding ring had been engraved with his real name and also his wife's, along with the date of their wedding possibly. Alexander finally got Höss to remove the ring, and the intertwined names of Rudolf and Hedwig Höss were discovered on the inside of the ring, engraved in. This small romantic gesture was what confirmed that one of the worst war criminals of the Second World War was now inside of Allied captivity. With this, Rudolf Höss's real identity was confirmed, but the arrest ordeal would not be over. Hans Alexander then left his men to oversee the prisoner for some time. This was not the most responsible thing to do. Presumably he was reporting the capture to higher ranking officials, but in this time he had left his men with a box of axe handles and the former commandant of Auschwitz. For 10 minutes Alexander's guard force brutalised Rudolf Höss, smashing him with the axe handles and weapons, and they beat him black and blue, kicking him all over his body too. They wanted to take the life of the man who had been responsible for 1.1 million people's deaths, and Alexander was warned that if he did not tell his men to stop the beatdown, then they would be bringing back a corpse. Alexander then ordered his men to stand down, but Höss had been beaten badly, and he was left bloodied and bruised. He was then taken into Allied captivity, and he later wrote of his treatment at this time that, "During the first interrogation they beat me to obtain evidence. I do not know what was in the transcript, or what I said, even though I signed it, because they gave me liquor and beat me with a whip. It was too much for me to bear. The whip was my own. By chance it had found its way into my wife's luggage. My horse had hardly ever been touched by it, much less the prisoners. Somehow one of the interrogators probably thought that I'd used it to constantly whip the prisoners. After a few days I was taken to Minden on the Weser River, which was the main interrogation centre in the British zone. There they treated me even more roughly, especially the first British prosecutor, who was a major. The conditions in the jail reflected the attitude of the first prosecutor. Compared to where I'd been before, imprisonment with the International Military Tribunal was like staying in a health spa. Höss claimed that he had even been beaten by his own whip, and he thought that the British interrogators believed that he had used this upon concentration camp prisoners. He was tortured and different tactics were used to extract information from him. But by the time he was extradited to Poland, he was said to have come to terms with his destructive actions. He later wrote, my conscience compels me to make the following declaration. In the solitude of my prison cell, I've come to the bitter recognition that I've sinned gravely against humanity. As Commandant of Auschwitz, I was responsible for carrying out part of the cruel plans of the Third Reich for human destruction. In doing so, I have inflicted terrible wounds on humanity. I caused unspeakable suffering for the Polish people in particular. I am paying for this with my life. May the Lord God forgive me one day for what I've done. I ask the Polish people for forgiveness. In Polish prisons, I experienced for the first time what human kindness really is. Despite all that has happened, I have experienced humane treatment which I could never have expected, and which has deeply shamed me. May the facts which are now coming out about the horrible crimes against humanity make the repetition of such cruel acts impossible for all time. Inside the walls of Auschwitz concentration camp, Rudolf Höss was brought for his execution. He had been condemned, but the Polish Supreme National Tribunal made special arrangements for him for his execution to occur inside the walls of his former camp. He was led through the site to the gallows made by German prisoners of war, and he was the last person to lose his life inside of Auschwitz, the camp which he oversaw. He was someone who tried to take his own life during his arrest, and his beatdown at the hands of the British forces could have killed him if the commanding officer did not intervene at last, and there were a number of accounts of this happening with Allied soldiers administering their own form of justice all over Europe. But Rudolf Höss was executed on the gallows, and his punishment at the hands of the arresting forces was rough, but would be considered justified. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.